Thank you, Shino. The thanks are also due to the Department of Philosophy. As Shinod mentioned, comparative literature has been quite active in organizing talks, lectures, interactions between various departments. This series also reminded us, not just me, but many of our faculty members, a forum called Focus, which ran from 98 to 2002, roughly. Right? Focus was a forum for cultural studies. This was one of the earliest and perhaps very innovative initiatives that comparative literature then took. Of course, I was a student then. I was not. I was a student in English, not even in comparative literature. But then Professor Chitra Panikar, Professor Kulkarni from philosophy, Professor Shashid, Sanjay, and a whole lot of people were actively part of this initiative called Focus, for Forum for Comparative Literature. And this series kind of reminded me of that, where you invite people to talk about their work, not necessarily around comparative literature, but this interaction with various scholars and their work is quite enriching, and I should thank philosophy for that. I think I've been very comfortable during COVID and even after COVID talking to only MA students, and this kind of makes me jittery. And also, the work that Shinod mentioned, I've been working on the politics of languages. So this is kind of continuation of that work, and also other work that I have done. This is also part of the longer work which I've just submitted. In my attempt to cut the story short, I hope I'll make some sense. But yeah, I'm hoping I'll talk around 40 minutes or so, and the interaction can clear things up if I don't make much sense. So, the field of comparative literature has been made possible on the foundations of multilingualism, the flourishing of n number of language, literary, and cultural systems, and also contestations among them. Of course, early scholars like Henry Remark, the American, have questioned this focus of comparative literature on multilingualism and posited that comparative literature is a discipline that can connect various forms of artistic and cultural expressions even within one language. This, in turn, Remark's position has also been further critiqued, especially because in the history of the discipline of comparative literature, this kind of a focus on one language and its cultural systems has led to the birth of a very monolingual metropolitan understanding of cultural studies. Right? This is where Spivak comes in. But then in the Indian context, there is a huge prioritizing of the multilingual, especially in the comparative Indian literature, and positioning the Indian literary scenario as equivalent to the whole of Europe in terms of geocultural and language literary systems. While this is agreeable to some extent, what troubles me is the nature of multilingual itself. More than the question of how India is multilingual, I am interested in the question of why the written forms of language that have constituted the corpus of knowledge in comparative literature, uh, indeed, not just comparative literature, the written forms of knowledge constitute the corpus of knowledge in pretty much every other discipline. Most post-colonial paradigms and post-colonial scholars, despite their differences in approach, have largely claimed colonialism as classifying and consolidating linguistic, caste, religious, and other identities of the colonized. Bernard Cohn's meticulous work argues how different forms of native knowledge systems had different specialists, and how all these specialists were multilingual and had a command of specialized languages, note specialized, these specialized languages necessary for communication amongst and between foreigners and Indians. Lisa Mitchell, who's also worked on Telugu, furthers this argument, In much of the Indian subcontinent, it was not unusual for literary production, pedagogy, government business, and everyday communication all to take place in multiple languages. Unlike today, however, one was not expected to be able to do everything in every language in order to claim competency. Instead, individual languages typically took on specialized roles, unquote, Lisa Mitchell. While this is largely true, this taking of specialized roles is largely true for languages that were accepted and are accepted to have specialized roles in pre colonial times, as in, let's say, Telugu was specialized for its use in classical music, Telugu and Dakkani in marketplaces, Persian in the court, and so on in the Deccan region, for example. You can add Arabic for religious purposes. So all these languages had specific roles in specific spheres. The question for us to ask is how and why languages, let us say, again in the Deccan region, Gondi, Chenchu, Koya, and so on and so forth, and these others, what are the roles that they have played in these specialized spheres? These languages, or many such languages, have hardly had a public or institutional presence, whether it is then or now. What specialized role did such languages perform? Why do languages of minorities remain largely in the private domain, their specific role being the domain of the private, be it home or the community? More importantly, could everyone access these specialized languages in the pre colonial times or even now? Could everyone learn what is known as classical music in Telugu? Could anyone perform the duties of the accountant or of the priest conducted in a specific language? Or could anyone use the language of the court? So, then, where exactly do we locate multilingual forms of knowledge that comparative literature has been founded upon? How are these made available to us, these languages and their knowledge systems, in academics and to others as well? How do these contemporary discourses on pre colonial functioning of languages and knowledge make writing, the act of writing, the practice of writing, and written history central to the project of knowledge, central to the project of literary history, be it colonial, be it post colonial, or nationalist, or the contemporary? So, these are the larger questions, in fact, that I attempt in two chapters in what I have submitted, but I'm trying to be very brief about my thoughts around these questions. Most of us, commoners and scholars alike, we tend to valorize, glorify multilinguality, right? India is a multilingual country, and so on and so forth. This is not this not only in some ways it succumbs to a certain orientalist tendency, exoticizing the existence of multiple languages, many languages, diverse cultures, but also uncritically maps West as a very homogeneous category, right? And West becomes very monolingual, monoculture, very uncritically. There are many such accounts. I mean, there are many scholars who have uh, uh, positioned themselves on this multilingual nature of comparative literature of India itself, be it Amiya Dev, Swapan Majumdar, early comparatists, Sisir Kumar Das, Sachidanandan, the Malayalam poet, Suniti Chatterjee, and a whole lot of people. To this, I find Harish Trivedi's probing question, who or what is multilingual, very insightful. Harish Trivedi, I quote, when we say India is a multilingual country, do we mean that the people living in the country are multilingual, or that even if most of them are multilingual as individuals, the country on the whole is multilingual because there are many languages spoken in the region and thus greater than the sum of its parts? Right? Unquote. Tarkeshwar, who teaches in FLU, carries this argument further and argues how institutions in independent India, especially academic literary studies based in university departments and in institutions like Sahitya Academy, are based on a single language, right? They recognize work in single language, and although in many languages, but each one of them recognizes single language per se. And this itself is a product of linguistic nationalism, according to Tarkeshwar, which point towards monolingualism and not multilingualism. This is also corroborated with data from Government of India census, which both Trivedi and Tarakeshwar draw from, and argue that most Indians are in fact monolingual. This is 2011 census data. Further, Trivedi points to how we cannot really take into consideration the small section of elite in academia who are more likely to be bi or multilingual, a context that is similar to the elite of the monarchic court, where the people in the court were likely to be the only recognized multilinguals. This, as Trivedi writes, is an exception to the rule, rather than the rule. Also note that in contemporary India, the rate of bilingualism is comparatively high among the speakers of non-scheduled languages. So bilingualism is not a phenomena among major dominant languages of India, but bilingualism and multilingualism is prominent only among the speakers of smaller non-scheduled languages, thus making it clear that it is indeed the speakers of minority languages who speak, may not write or read many languages, and this likely out of necessity. This is not a new phenomena that was observed. M.B. Emmanuel, a very revered linguist, American linguist, observed this in the early 20th century in the context of Nilgiri Hills, where many languages are spoken. Right? And he also said how multilinguality functions basically at the extreme ends of our society. Uh, one belonging to the very learned and academic, where you learn the languages that are current, that will give you a certain capital, social, cultural, or otherwise. Whereas at the other end, there are speakers of minoritized languages and ethno-linguistic minorities who cannot function in their own languages in a sphere outside of their community, right? They cannot function without acquiring the dominant language of the region. We see that it is people who inhabit geopolitical cusps, Kasargod, Kodagu, and any number of, I mean, Adilabad and the Maharashtra border and so on and so forth, ethno-linguistic minorities and other minorities who, for reasons of survival, are made to learn the dominant language of the region or will have to learn the public and institutional language through which worthy language is imparted. It is these people who are likely to be multilingual, while the speakers of dominant languages have no reason to learn other languages precisely because of the pervasive and dominant presence of their language and their knowledge. In the context of Telangana, for example, the expectations will always be on a Gondi speaker to learn Telugu, or in West Bengal, a Ho or Santali speaker to learn Bangla or Hindi, and never the other way around. This is a point that most valorizations of multilinguality in India miss. The obvious difference between many languages spoken in a given region, right? In Hyderabad, you could have Telugu, Urdu, Dakkani, Hindi, Kannada, Marathi, and so on. Many languages are spoken in Hyderabad, but each individual may not speak more than one language, right? So that is a difference distinction which is very crucial. Also lost is another point that, as I said, it's only at the extreme ends of the societal hierarchy that multilingual usually operates. What is important for me in this debate is this: the knowledge systems that we are in, institutions that we are in, have posited extraordinary values in the written forms of very few languages that are available around us. While questioning the foregrounding of writing in the making of history, in the making of knowledge, I find Prathama Banerjee very useful, who notes that language scenario among multilingual spaces connecting the Adivasis and the non-Adivasis have been monolingualized during colonial and also during the nationalist time. So the turn she takes is, unlike the other post-colonial scholars, Prathama Banerjee is also looking at nationalist times and nationalist material to say how nationalism also turned towards monolingualism, not just the colonial period. The problem Banerjee points to is the historical conditions that have made Adivasi languages unqualified to enter the club of literary vernaculars. Understanding Adivasi histories that are culturally, politically, and linguistically different from that of the caste communities require a methodology through which dominant tools of history, literature, and ideologies can be challenged. And I think working with languages is a good place to begin. How does such a field, such a complicated field, not just of comparative literature, but the formation of knowledge itself, compel us to rethink our relationship with the text that we analyze, archive, and field, that is the evidentiary paradigm that grounds social science and humanities today? Be it history, be it political science, or comparative literature. Studies thus far have largely focused on histories of languages that have had a written record. The focus thus being on writing as primary text, whether it is in term of record, archive, etc., as the primary text used for analysis, writing as reliable evidence, a methodology that has often gone unquestioned, even as critiques of positivist empiricism have become commonplace. What Pratama Banerjee does is this. She argues how Adivasis are not seen as embodiment of past history, precisely because neither a written literature nor institutionalized religion was central to their history. When you look at university course outlines, or when you look at what uh, has become canons in each disciplines, you see that language literary systems or knowledge systems that have a written literature, or systems belonging to institutionalized religions, they are the ones whose histories have become generalized as histories of this world. And and this is why, because Adivasis or minoritized communities do not either have written literature or they do not belong to institutionalized religions, ethnography has become a very convenient tool for non-Adivasis to construct Adivasi lives, right? So through ethnography, one is constructing Adivasi lives because written records, quote unquote, are not available easily. And even here, note that it is Adivasi lives that are constructed and not Adivasis histories. That is much more complicated, and you need much more nuanced engagement with material available. Although there has been considerable work on oral histories, it is marked as a separate domain away from the boundaries of History proper. History proper and its method do not consider our utterances, our representations, in effect, all part of oralities as history. Well, there have been many scholars, noted ones being Ranjit Guha or Raja Iskaria, who have showed us how writing and history are statist projects, right? Projects belonging to the state. Uh, and statism, both of them argue, and many others have also argued, that these status projects are gifts of European modernity and colonialism. This actually becomes, again, like I said about multilingualism, European modernity or Europe itself becomes a very not a contested category, but an easy category to juxtapose India with. Nevertheless, this becomes interesting when Sheldon Pollock inserts the aesthetics of language in the representation of political culture in South Asia. So, what does Pollock do? For Pollock, history and representation of political culture, available mainly through written literary cultures and inscriptions, is ample evidence of how writing and historical representation is inseparably connected to the political power in pre colonial South Asia. So, history and writing is not just a European status project, but history and political culture is, and writing is very much a project of South Asian political cultural system as well. What is significant in Pollock's work is the centrality assigned to language, writing, and aesthetics in unraveling the relationship between historiography and political culture. the power of writing, the written records connection to dominant knowledge and to the dominant ritual and political power. So it's not just political culture and history. Pollock interestingly and very significantly brings in the religious aspect to it as well, the ritual religious aspect to it. So how written and knowledge systems are connected to ritual and political power in pre-colonial South Asia, Pollock traces it to at least 2000 years in the Indian subcontinent, and obviously this is much prior to colonialism's state projects. Uh, I have been quoting using Bowen and Briggs for a very long time, um, and I find their work not just significant but very illuminating. In the European context, they study England and to some extent Germany, Herder, and so on, but also for us to understand the Indian context. So Bauman and Briggs, they explore how Europe's modernity is built on of language ideologies that emerge from and create new political and social inequalities. So modernity, the project of modernity for Bauman and Briggs is very much connected to language. And of course, by language, it's not just language somewhere else that exists somewhere else, but languages of whom people are part of which people are part of. With the coming of print, right? In the pre-colonial times, if it was the writing manuscript, with the coming of the print, they argue, the transposition of the word then from speaking to print was assimilated to the great divide between past and present, right? And it has remained central to modernizing understanding to this day. But this process of modernization in Europe has had its own other, wherein oral tradition, I quote, oral tradition became the foundation of a poetic of otherness, a means of identifying the pre modern, both within modern society, which is could be uneducated, rural, poor, female, and outside it, savage, primitive, preliterate. So, what is Bauman and Briggs are doing? How using orality, how using certain class varieties of languages in the European context, the society was seen, or it became easy to distinguish between the past and the present, essentially to say these societies are pre modern, they speak a certain kind of language, they do not belong to this knowledge system which is very modern. So, language became a very crucial classifying category to categorize past, present, primitive, modern, non modern, pre modern, and so on and so forth. So what they're essentially doing is provincializing pre-colonial Europe, right? And what Pollock does is also provincializing and of course cosmopolitizing contemporary pre-colonial South Asia. At the same time, they are desacralizing the written or the scripted word, and they are elaborating on the changing relationship of writing to power, gendered, casteist, and statist within India. So this the next section I've titled "How then can we understand orality?" So although my abstract and the title doesn't reflect this, uh, when I was putting this together, I thought we cannot understand or we cannot critique writing without bringing in orality. So, following Bauman and Briggs, what interests me about orality and modernity is the contradiction of how, because of its long history of existence, oral tradition or folklore becomes a modern construct. Like how tradition itself is a construct of the modern, orality or oral culture is also a construct of the modern, right? Morality has been constructed always in opposition to the modern, as belonging to, as I said, non modern people, to lesser people, thereby arguing how modernity is essentially built on inequalities of languages and people, a point which Talal Asad also makes in 1986, Bauman and Briggs writing in 2003. How these constructive constructs that use language and writing and orality, print and orality as categories that marked people in contrasting unequal ways is the question for me and perhaps for all of us. One could ask many more such questions around writing and orality. Can writing be studied independently of orality? How do we understand the primacy posited in writing while orality is largely studied today via the written text? That's also a contradiction, right? We study orality through recorded means, whether it is written or audio or visual and so on and so forth. So it would actually be very self evident that different material practices of writing give rise to and are in turn shaped by different ways of imagining language, memory, utterances, and knowledge. Further, writing for many of us is also based on hearing, learning, experiencing, and thinking, right? And field based research, for example, and its writing up, isn't it not entirely dependent on non-written forms of representation? So what I'm trying to say is how one cannot actually contrast writing and orality, but we need to see how in different ways writing and orality engage with each other, especially today. Today, while much of the oral tradition is documented in writing or recording and made accessible to the reading public, the paradox is this: orality, once which was accessible to all who knew the language, is now made accessible to those who can read, right? Often to those who do not know or speak the language. In effect, it is made accessible to those who cannot or are not willing to listen. When I pointed out how oral transmission of songs in Kodava, my language, had almost stopped, my father, who is now in his 80s and he's lived all his life, still lives in Kodagu, he said something very interesting. He pointed out how during his childhood he would go cattle grazing with his friends and siblings, and that was like a village common ground where boys, usually boys who took cattle to graze, when the cattle was grazing, they sat together, learned songs, learned stories, learned many more things as well, right? It acted as a knowledge space in effect. But today, with the changing economy, there are hardly people who take cattle to graze. There are hardly any village common grounds. Everything is now individual property. And therefore, the economy of the space, economy of the people, economy of the region has considerably changed, and so has the culture around it. But what was interesting for me was how my father, a school teacher, connected this economy, the local economy, with culture, right? And without any nostalgia, or without any nostalgia for a kind of revivalism that is taking root in almost all minority communities. A pervasive idea around language communities that are oral also revolves around the idea of the script. Now, this is something that I have extended in the longer version to which Shinod had referred to, that the idea that every language needs to have a script seems very peculiar to the Indian situation. The moment you say, I speak Santali or I speak Ladakhi, right? The question that is asked, even by academics or in popular or among commoners, is: does your language have a script? Does your language have a written literature? This is extremely annoying, believe me, and please don't ask anyone who tells you that they speak some other language that you haven't heard of, right? So, why is this script question so very central, especially in India? I often take this example. If you look at Europe, right? French, Spanish, English, German, name any language except few, they're all written in Roman script, right? I mean, there are linguists in this room, so they can correct me, but yeah, much of the European languages are written in the Roman script. Much of the North Indian Indo-Aryan languages are modified versions of Devanagari. Telugu and Kannada are pretty much similar. One can read even if you don't know the language, right? But then when it comes to quote unquote smaller languages, this question, again, like what Bauman and Briggs says, the non requirement of a script for most of these people. I don't say the lack of the script, but the non requirement of a script becomes a reason to assign no literature, no history, and therefore lesser people, right? Uh, so all languages, major languages that are also dominant, have used the script to propagate the knowledge that they have held valuable, they have held important. Along with the religion, writing has always been used by the state power, initially to keep records of administration and revenue tax and so on and so forth, and the manner in which this has continued in powerful and become powerful in the print capitalist and nationalist economy of today has only pushed people of minoritized languages into a very complicated relationship with the languages of the nation state and of imperialism, which is made very evident in the manner uh, of how Indian state is divided along the linguistic lines. And I quote G.N. Devi, who says, the languages that had scripts were counted when linguistic reorganization of state happened. The ones that had not acquired script and therefore did not have printed literature did not get their own states. Schools and colleges were established only for the official languages. The ones without script, even if they had a great stock of wisdom carried forward through several means, were not fortunate enough to get educational institutions for them. So, the elevation of the written through history and through literary cultures, Pollock argues, is through a network of power and culture. But then, how this power has denigrated orality, not just within the written cultures themselves, but especially of communities that lay outside the privileges of written, this points not to how orality, in fact, this is also Pollock saying, he says orality is incapable of producing history of a sort that writing can. But how, disagreeing with that, we need to ask how the many kinds of history that orality constantly produces, and it actually becomes unwieldy, right? One cannot understand or control this kind of histories that orality produces, because for practices of history and power, the absolute nature of written text or of inscription lends itself as an easy text, right? When you're written, when you write, it's much more easier, legible, and therefore controllable, which this kind of easy evidence orality evades. It doesn't lend itself so easily for power. This very nature of orality that makes history unyielding to power is what, according to James Scott, is orality's advantages. Using many examples from communities of Southeast Asia, James Scott argues, I quote, oral traditions then appear to provide, under certain circumstances, something of a word for word constancy of a fixed written text, together with the potential flexibility of strategic adjustment and change. So, unlike written text, orality can provide you with a fixed kind of a word, fixed kind of a truth, in addition to being very fluid, right? And orality is very malleable, very adjustable to change. They can, as if it were, both have it both ways. They can claim to be precise ur text, while in fact being substantially novel, innovative, and there is no easy way of evaluating this claim. The reasons for strategic and opportunistic adaptations of oral traditions are manifold. Once it is fully appreciated that any account of custom, genealogy, or history is situated and interested account, variation over time is a presumed norm. Not just this, but oral cultures are superbly adapted to travel and change, as shifting cultivation and physical mobility. These histories that are represented by oral cultures change themselves according to current conditions and context, and in contrast, written history freezes one account, provincializes historiography, and written history freezes one account and passes the very same to future generations as the truth. The difference is that selective forgetting and remembering is more unobtrusive and more evident and smoother in the case of oral tradition, right? And of course, this selective nature of history is amenable by anyone who has access to the language and not necessarily to people with power. But in the written version, there is never an acknowledgement of its selective nature precisely because it comes with the power and authority. To question the veracity of the written word is to question authority itself. The turn Scott gives to his understanding of orality is to connect orality to people whose political and social organization is communitarian and not based on centralized state systems. So there's a very strong connection between orality and state power that Scott is making. Such groups have been historically very unwieldy and remained outside the monarchical or other state systems. And they're also typically stigmatized by neighboring cultures as peoples without history. That today language has to be written, needs to be written is a given, right? There is, I don't think any scholar or anybody who can argue that we will remain oral. There is no pure orality, so to speak. Although many languages have survived thousands of years without the necessity of using the script, the economy and context in which they survived was entirely different. There were languages of gods, languages of religion, languages of the court, languages of political and cultural expansion, including colonialism, including nationalism, that exclusively held the power of writing. Lesser languages were used in different modes, be it performative, day to day, skill based, knowledge production, art, craft production, and so on and so forth, and have survived in their own locales until the arrival of new economies connected to colonialism, capitalism, nationalism, and so on. Linguistic minorities and other minorities who were until recently based in specific locales, restricted to caste community based occupations with no access to privileged knowledge of the script, have begun to be mobile, migrant, and sometimes in very difficult and disempowering condition. But also at times these mobilities are also have also been enabling. This requires new understandings of how languages are traveling, how languages have become mobile with the people who are becoming mobile. And uh, I think the digital space is something that we need to explore as to how language is changing its forms from the written kind of form to perhaps audio and visual kind of forms. Now, how much time have I taken? Okay, the last part of this is I begin with asking what then is comparative literature. What I've done is chart multilingualism and writing as quite central to comparative literature, but also questioning this premise conceptually. So, how do we understand comparative literature once we draw attention to the problems with multilingualism and writing? In fact, this is a question that I think all of us in comparative literature face every now and then. What is comparative literature? This is like a question: does your language have a script? What is comparative literature, right? So, I was interviewed for assistant professor, associate, or even professor's post. This was one question that remained constant, and in the road or in the hostel, anywhere you go, what is comparative literature is a staple question. um, in fact, this is very amusing because in the history of emergence and institutionalization of comparative literature as a discipline, this institutionalization happened much earlier than many disciplines that we know of today, right? So, despite knowing the nature and practice of disciplines have changed enormously over the last 100 years, and despite our understanding that notions of knowledge itself has undergone drastic transformation over years, this question, what is comparative literature, seems to be specific to disciplines such as comparative literature only because I think they are multilingual, to some extent interdisciplinary, and only because this becomes so very complex and unwieldy like orality itself. Right? You can't uh, define it, so to speak, definition. So it is very unwieldy, and it also doesn't cater to neoliberal markets like certain disciplines do. So comparative literature, therefore, can be unwieldy like orality itself and is very difficult to tie to one single frame. It is one, it is many, it is confirming at times, confirming to the dominant. It can also be very contesting simultaneously all the time. I say only because it is only multilingual and so on and so forth, because it's extremely amusing to ask what is English literature or what is Hindi literature, albeit recognizing that English, Hindi, Kannada, or all unitary literary disciplines have been undergoing changes, like or unlike comparative literature, and also in these disciplines itself, what constitutes the discipline and practice has also been changing. But this question seems very peculiar to disciplines like comparative literature. In effect, therefore, because it is unwieldy, comparative literature breaks many territories, territorialities of disciplines, not just in its method, but in its very conception itself. Early 19th century, when a time when Europe was strife with national struggles, nation formation, was also the time when the need to consolidate a national language, national literature, national history comes about. This contradictorily, when there is a need to consolidate a national culture, national history, and so on, this was also the time when the need for a comparative literature that cut across the narrowness of national culture and national literatures was felt, right? Thus making multilinguality its premise, your premise, cutting across languages and boundaries, though multilinguality is outside of the nation, not within the nation. From Goethe onwards, who bemoaned the lack of strong unified Germany and associated German literary culture in the early 19th century, and who argues for a Weltliteratur that broke the cultural and national boundaries, thereby envisioning a better world in a war-ridden Europe, we literally and also literarily see comparative literature's irreverence for territories, political or culture. This blurring and moving across boundaries of comparative literature has come with a baggage that is quite burdensome as well. From the Greco Roman times until recently, comparison was an act carried out between entities that were powerful, right? With comparison or the study of different languages was always associated with the transfer of studies, transfer of arts, and transfer of imperialism. Right? This is a phrase in Latin which I'll pronounce how I can. Translate your study and translate your imperi, right? So transfer of culture and transfer of arts has never been inseparable from the transfer of the empire itself, from the transfer of power itself. The way Greek and Latin moved to the west, from Greece and Italy to England, France, and so on and so forth. So the way Greco Latin culture moved to the West, from then onwards until today, one can always associate the relationship between languages and people as transfer of arts and transfer of imperialism. So, uh, so that the transfer of studies and of the arts and the transfer of imperialism are inseparable, and imperialism in our context can be substituted by colonialism or racism or gender or caste is only too evident. It is within these powers of transfers and comparison that one, national cultures of most nations are consolidated. The construction and homogenization of a particular literary history on which national culture is imagined, the standardization of a particular language and its connection to the national culture, constitution of a glorious national past that has brought dominant language, literature, culture, history together, all these realms that made the nation possible essentially belong to particular sections of society, thereby being selective in choosing languages, choosing people and their histories, and also selective in erasing others. This is what has made national literatures what they are, and made possible these imagined national literatures and cultures to be studied in juxtaposition to each other, which comparative literature does. The making of comparative literature and the violent making of the nation states has been a story that has been told. Likewise, the making of comparative literature and strengthening of colonialism is also a story that has been told. But for me, and perhaps for all of us, I think what we need to do is to look at how comparative literature or the study of cultural literary systems, what has it done to our own people, right? The relationship between colonialism and the colonizer and the colonized, and the role literary history cultures played there, and the role nationalist histories have played among our own people. Following many others, I argue that it is actually translation that is quite central in understanding how uh, our nationalism, the ideas of nationalism, has taken into being. I argue that it is indeed translation that characterizes our thoughts, our fieldwork, our listening, our observation, note making, the power of our interpretation and writing, and in fact, everything that we inhabit and express. In addition, it is translation that urges us to recognize and work with the interdisciplinarity that is embedded or enmeshed within networks of power that the world and the work of academics function. And because translation, both in practice and in theory, necessitates comparison, involves more than one entity, be it language, be it culture, be it representation, uh, S. Shankar's positioning of translation practice as a comparative practice becomes very significant. While translation is largely and popularly understood as and conceived as a practice, in relation to two or more languages, increasingly and especially with the rise of post-colonial studies, translation is understood as a political discourse closely related to representation. If the understanding of translation as a bridge that brings many languages and cultures together is quite limiting, this in itself acknowledges the complexity of the act of translating. Uh, Beginning it with Edward Said, who showed us the significance of literary representation in the consolidation of colonialism, and continuing with Talal Asad, who brought to our notice the significant play of translation and language of inequalities in anthropological and sociological writing, the notion that all representations, ethnographic or literary, are translations that operate within a complex sphere is now simply commonplace. This blurring of disciplinary boundaries via translation has enriched the interpretative nature of humanities and social sciences, and places translation at the center of all text making, all representation. With one example, I'll conclude. This is the idea of how Indian nation state is made. The making of Indian nation state, the imagining of Indian nation state, as with all other nations, has relied heavily on the intended, unintended collaborative work of European Orientalists and Indian nationalists via translation. The translation of Sanskrit texts at first and later of different texts, religious texts, political texts, literary texts, in addition to ethnographic writings by the Europeans, have attempted to understand, know, control the subcontinent's people, history, and culture. What it is do is pave way to constitute a body of Indian literature and Indian culture. Right? How did this body of Indian literature come to be? Via translations of the so-called ancient texts. And this body of Indian literature that was constituted via translation, even conceptualized via translation, it went on to still represents a continuous Indian national high Hindu culture on which the identity of India as a modern political nation was and is built. In fact, translation is the only mode, the only method that brings disparate languages, unequal people, disparate people together as an imagined one. Indeed, nation and also English go hand in hand, because it is translation from varied languages of India and translation into English that the idea of Indian nation comes to being. I will stop here, and yeah, hopefully there'll be some interaction. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sowmya.